Here we go. Okay, this new bulletin gives more this thing. All right, so today's show is sponsored A Year of Learning by Sue and Anne Gorelick in memory of Malka Pearlman and Philip Mann, in memory of all their survivors of the Holocaust. By Cheryl Scher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook. Marsha Federbush and family, and member of her husband, Dr. Uriel Paul Federbush. Sharon and Fred Risker, their family and many friends, in memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman. Leslie and Gail Kaplan, in memory of their parents, Harry, Marjorie Sadel, and Irving and Pearl Kaplan. Friends of Avi Gittler and Martha Gittler. Friends of Toby Paris, friends of Malka Levy, friends of Joe Wolf, the many friends of Moshe Shalom Ben Yiska, of Dr. Marvin Blush. Then there's a month of learning that's sponsored by Mindel and David Cheslow in memory of her mother, Carol and Josh Sambourne in memory of her mother, Mel and Haran Haller in memory of his brother, Jill and Perry Meltzer in memory of his father and her mother, and then sponsored also for a month of learning for Refuah Shalema by Stephanie and Fred Morton in memory of her daughter. In honor of her, in a Refuah Shalema of her daughter. And then sponsored a week of learning in memory of Judy Ager in memory of her father. And then today, the Yortzat in memory of Rosalind Greenberg Haskell in memory of her father. May all the Nishamot have an aliyah, and may that the merit of our learning also be in good health and good happiness for everybody that joins the class and everybody in the world, and may COVID finally be coming to the end so that we can all start doing these shurim again in person. All right, so I'm going to begin a little bit with review. So basically, the point of my class last week was to introduce the idea of what I would be doing in my part two of Epistemology of Tefila, which was to be focusing on all the Shabbat prayers in more detail. So a lot of you asked me to go in a lot more detail of the Psalms that we say during the services. And a lot of you also asked me to talk about more detail of the intermediate prayers. I also didn't deal with a lot of stuff because I did a lot of summaries of the main ideas of the services. I didn't really go so much into the details of the specific services. So I wanted to just make sure that we would review the stuff that I've done. Okay, so we started last week with looking at Mincha, okay, which is, remember, there's 3 services really on Friday nights, okay, if you go to shul. So the first one would be the Erev Shabbat service of Mincha, which you say before Shabbat starts. Then you would have the second one, which would be Kabbalat Shabbat. So Kabbalat Shabbat would be the next section. And then finally, you go back into the Ma'ariv of Shabbat. So those are the 3 on Friday nights that if you attend shul, you would have. I also mentioned that somewhere in the middle of that, there has to be the lighting of candles, because the lighting of candles is also part of Kabbalat Shabbat. And again, I mentioned that depending on your customs and depending what your rabbis say, would be depending on how and when you light the candles. Specifically at the moment, actually in Florida, South Florida, the times for lighting candles, and even in New York and in other, even lots of places, the times for lighting candles can be very late at the moment, okay? Because based on, remember we studied before, the halachic hours. So again, it's a good thing to ask your rabbi what you do. I could give you an example about what I do. When I asked my rabbi in South Africa, one of the things that I would do is I would light my candles at home without having the intention that my candles would actually bring in Shabbat at that time. And then I would get in a car and drive to synagogue. And when I got to synagogue, I would say the prayers. And then once the prayers, I said certain prayers, those prayers would bring in Shabbat for me. Okay, I know that in the shul bulletin, they have a different opinion, which would possibly be the opinion of Rabbi Yaska and maybe people at the Rabbinical Council of America. Again, they say that women shouldn't go and light their candles before a certain time. And I don't know how that works, which means maybe you could go to shul, come home and light your candles. I'm not exactly sure how all of that works. But I think as a result of that, it's become a really not a good custom that women have not gone to shul on Friday nights. And personally, for me, I think that's a big gap in a woman's connection to Hashem, not davening Friday nights in a synagogue and not learning how davening in a Friday night in a synagogue works. So that's going to be my focus for the first quite a few weeks. I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to also tie in, as I've said before, as I said last week, I'm going to tie in with the different tunes that are sung at that time during the services. And I'm also going to have some discussion on some of the different parts from the Talmud and the Mishnah that are actually read during those parts of the service, okay? And different songs that are sung and hymns that are sung Tehillim, but not just Tehillim, certain of our liturgy that actually was composed by Chazanim and that is actually sung during our services. So as a bit of a recap from again last week, but again for those of you who didn't attend last week, we're going to start in the Siddur with the Mincha service. So if you're in the Mincha service, and you basically, if you're following what we do in the, what we call, remember, oh, sorry, there was one other thing I mentioned last week. There's generally, there are two nusachs that we have at Torah Or, okay? Torah Or has Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfarad. Okay, now it's not, Nusach Sfarad is not Sfaradi at all, okay? It's very close to Nusach Ashkenaz, but it's a little different. Again, I'm not so sure the reasons. I'm sure Marty Levine could tell me the reasons because he has the historic background. But the differences are very, very minimal. In fact, in Israel, my cousin that lives in Male Adumim, he goes to a shul that's Nusach Sfarad, where I've davened. And I just take my Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur and I use it. They even have Nusach Ashkenaz Siddurim there. And I just follow the Ashkenaz custom. Okay, again, I don't know if anybody has this in America where they go to a Nusach Sfarad minyan, and again, they follow the Nusach Sfarad custom, but you'll notice it's not really much different than the Nusach Ashkenaz. You should know that in the winter, yeah, at our shul, they do have a Nusach Sfarad minyan, okay, in the winter season, because there's enough people that want to follow the Nusach Sfarad. So I'm going to mention, as we go through the class, some of the customs from the Nusach Sfarad. I actually have an art scroll with the Nusach Sfarad. Okay, now the way you know the difference between which art scroll you're using is based on what it says over here. If you actually look, this one will say Sfarad, okay, which means Nusach Sfarad. It means it's following the customs of the Sfarad. Whereas if you look at the one that we use in our art scroll, you will see that it'll say Nusach Ashkenaz. Okay, well, it doesn't even just say Nusach, it says Ashkenaz. Okay, so that's what it says. So this is the one that we use in our shul, the Ashkenaz. Some people still prefer the brown one. But if you look at the brown one like this, that we also still have in our shul, it also says Ashkenaz, okay? The only difference between the blue one and the gold one is the blue one was written by the RCA, which is the Rabbinical Council of America. And they decided to include a prayer for the state of America, for the United States of America. So you know that we say that in synagogue. Is the president to bless the president of the United States of America. And there's also included in this book a prayer to bless the state of Israel. So what used to happen at many synagogues before there was the RCA book and it wasn't produced and it wasn't being used, they used to use this gray one, which is, you could probably see my husband used to use it. It's a very old and well-used siddur. My husband. Okay, they used to use the brown one because and then they used to stick in the back of the siddurim, they would stick the prayers for the state of Israel and for the state of the US government. That was very common in the beginning until the RCA actually produced the book. In fact, when the shul was now doing the renovation, I noticed that there still are these books that have that stuck in. Okay, but the idea is, again, as long as we live in America, I think it should be our custom to follow what the RCA of America says, if that's what we believe in, and that's our philosophy of orthodoxy. And therefore, I'm going to mostly stick this, at the moment, I'm going to stick to this book. Obviously, I'm going to give commentaries and stuff from other siddurim that I have here. Like I will still refer to, obviously, the Koran, and I will still refer to the Nusach Sfarad book and things like that. But my main goal for this particular class now is going to focus on the Rabbinical Council of America book and the customs that they follow. So if we start on page 232 in the Siddur, you'll see that that's where the weekday mincha actually starts. So if you go to shul on a Friday night and you arrive in time for whatever time it's published in wherever you're davening, and they say it doesn't matter if it's early minyan, I don't know, regular minyan, late minyan, whatever minyan it is on a Friday night, it's going to be starting with the weekday mincha service, okay? So the weekday service, the weekday minyan service that starts on Ashrei is going to be exactly the same as the Ashrei we've already reviewed. And for those of you who want to, again, you can look back on the notes of the regular weekday mincha notes, which are available online. And you should see that the mincha service basically runs from page 232 up to 254. That would be the weekday mincha, just what we've learned before. Okay, as I mentioned last week, there's a couple of things to focus on as well when you're doing the weekday mincha. You should see, again, we've discussed this in a separate class. We did Kaddish in a separate class, but as on page 234, you should see that there's a Kaddish. And remember, we learned that's the half Kaddish, okay? It's the Chatzi Kaddish that the Chazan says. And it's used to separate parts of the service. So the Ashrei is separated with the Chatzi Kaddish before we start the Amida, okay? Or the Shmoneh Esrei in this particular case, as it's called. So that's a very important thing. When we learned the Kaddish, we spoke about why the half Kaddish was used to separate different parts of the service. Mm-hmm. It's also a time for everybody to know that they need to catch up. Basically, it's a time to know that you need to start finishing Ashrei, and you've got the time while the Kaddish is being said, the Chatzi Kaddish, to catch up and be able to say the Amida at the same time as everybody else. So when we get to the Amida, remember what the Amida is. The Amida is the standing prayer that we say standing. But again, as I've mentioned, if you're not able to say standing, it's not that important to say the whole prayer standing. Because as we get older, or when you're not well or something is not good with you and you can't stand, it's better not to stand. We'll focus on what the important parts are to stand at. But anyway, so what the weekday mincha is called the Shmoneh Esrei, is another Hebrew name for it, which remember we learned was 18 brachot. But remember, 18 brachot isn't really what we say. We say 19 because for some reason they decided to add a 19th bracha. But I have explained again, if you go back to the Amida part, which was the first 25 shiurim that I taught, again, I did explain why we added that extra verse. It had something to do with heretics and people being slanderous and people not taking care of other people. It was at the time of the destruction of the temple. So again, we still call it the Shmoneh Esrei. That's just the tradition, even though there are the 19 brachot. If you turn on to page 236 at the bottom, you'll see that there's a Kedusha, which means that if there's a Kedusha, it means that, remember we discussed Kaddish, Kedusha, and all of those things together at the same time. If there's a Kedusha, that's an important part to stand. Okay, if somebody would read for me, I don't know, Alice, you're unmuted. You can read the English before the Kedusha, and below where it says Kedusha. It says, when reciting Kedusha,
one must stand with his feet together and avoid any interruptions. One should rise to his toes when saying the words Kadosh, 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 and Baruch from Baruch Kavod and Yimkom.
Okay, so remember we learned that those were the 3 levels of the Kedusha, and that was the reason of us trying to get higher to Hashem, and that was the reason why we said the Kedusha. So Mincha, before Shabbat, will have the Kedusha as well, so that's another reason to think of davening with the minyan, because if you're not davening with the minyan, you wouldn't be able to say the Kedusha, and that's another reason why it's important to try to daven with a Mincha, because as we learned before, during COVID and stuff, we weren't allowed to say that Kedusha. We weren't allowed to do that. And we couldn't say these fantastic prayers, which remind us of the temple and of the holiness and getting closer to Hashem in the heavens. So that also means that weekday Mincha will have a repetition. Okay, so most places will do weekday Mincha with a repetition, meaning that they will make sure that they will say the weekday, privately, everybody will say the Mincha first by themselves, and then they will do a repetition. Some places, if they're in a hurry, because let's say they started a bit late and they know Shabbat's going to start, which is quite common, I guess, in the winter time, not so much in the summertime, they might do what we call a heicha kedusha, which is when they say part of the Amida first and the kedusha, and then they carry on, and everybody says the rest of the Amida silently to themselves. So that's another way of doing the Amida, so that you can save time before Shabbat if Shabbat is running late. it's quite common to see this in places where somehow they didn't get a minyan until last minute, or they were waiting for a minyan or something like that. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, at any time.
Okay. If you cannot stand, you can say Shemona Esrei sitting down.
Correct. The
But you
only
have
thing is,
to
again, they
but you
say,
have-
I mean, obviously it's always supposed to be you ask the rabbi, but I personally think that the idea of pikeach nefesh, which is to save a soul, meaning, saving your life or your soul or your spirit. In other words, if your back is sore and it's hurting you to stand, then I think you should only make the effort to stand for Kedusha. You know what I'm saying? That's the time that I would say you should make the effort. The rest of the time, I think you should be quite fine to sit with even out asking an opinion of a rabbi, because it basically falls under the pikeach nefesh law of not feeling well and not feeling good enough or strong enough to stand. That's what I would say. But again, it depends on your beliefs. If you believe that every single thing you have to ask the rabbi before you do it, then obviously that's what you do. But if you basically use common sense about certain things and you realize that that's the halacha to save the life and to do that, then you wouldn't do that. Okay, and then again, I'm not going to go completely through what the thing is, because we've done this millions of times about each of the different brachot, and we've been over all of the different 19 brachot. Remembering just to focus again, the first three and the last three are always the ones that are common to all amidot, and the middle ones are the ones that we just say during the week. Okay, that's why we add those extra ones. On Shabbat, we're gonna discuss the one when we get to Ma'ariv. Okay. Now, this is an interesting fact. Again, when you get to page, we've discussed this when we did regular mincha, but you don't do this now on Shabbat mincha. Go to page 250, please.
200 and what? I'm sorry.
250. Okay, now 250 is Tachanun, and we talked about that. That was where we put down the head, and we talked about it's a special prayer where we basically, it's the second stage of prayer. Okay, it's called supplication. We discussed that when we discussed Tachanun, and you say it during Mincha normally during the week, but you don't say it on Shabbat. You don't do it on Shabbat Mincha Erev Shabbat, and you don't do it on regular Shabbat Mincha either. So those two Minchas you actually leave out Tachanun. So those pages on 250, where it starts by Yomer David, or in other words, in English, it says, and David said to God, until you get to the next page, which is page 252, where it starts the Kaddish. So again, when you're in Shul and Mincha, you would notice that they would definitely skip that Tachanun there. They wouldn't say it, and they would go straight on to the Kaddish again. Okay, now the Kaddish that you see there is one of the Kaddishes we discussed. It's called the full Kaddish. Okay, the Kaddish Shalem in Hebrew, which is the full Kaddish. Okay, again, it's not a mourner's Kaddish. It's a Kaddish that's said by the Chazan. And the goal of it is to basically announce that it's going to be the end of the service again. Again, the point of all these things were often in Shul to, again, make people get ready to finish up and be ready to leave Shul at the same time and to be safe, okay? Because again, we don't want people walking by themselves leaving Shul. So we don't want to even a single man, we don't really want him to stay and carry on davening in Shul by himself. And even lock up by himself, even if he knows how to lock up the Shul or anything. Even today, this is appropriate. We don't want people to do that. We want people to know that we're coming to the end of the service for this particular service, and therefore we say the Kaddish, the Kaddish Shalem, the full Kaddish. Okay, and again, as I said before, it's obviously important to always say Amen, because Amen means you believe what's being said. We can go into this again in more detail. I did quite a lot of it in the class on Kaddish, which I did before Pesach. We spoke about the different Kaddishes. All right, and now we come to Aleinu, which is one of the prayers that again, I haven't been into in a lot of detail, but it's one of the prayers we know that always ends most of our tefillot. Okay, and it's basically, again, like similar, as I've said many times, to saying the Shema. It's the idea of announcing that there's just one God, and we just believe in one God, and we only bow down to one God, and believing that one day all the nations will do the same thing. That's basically, again, the connection to the Mashiach. So that's on page 252 and ends on page 254. Okay, but now if you look at just below the end of Aleinu, which by the way goes V'ne'emar vayar Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz vayomahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Okay, we all know that tune. We sing that in Shul often. You should see there's a prayer called Al Tira. Now, Altira, again, is very dependent on shuls. Most shuls, Ashkenazi, do not say Altira. Okay, in fact, it's not it isn't said in Torah or, it's not the custom of Torah or. People in the Sfard do it. I have heard, I don't know if any of you have ever davened with the woman's minyan for Rosh Chodesh, but if you've ever davened with that, you'll hear that they do say that, because again, the Nusach Sfard, it is in the Nusach Sfard Siddur, and they do it. The Sfardim definitely do it, as do all the like what do you call them, like Chabad and the Baba Hasidim, all the Hasidim, they all say that verse. Okay, it's an interesting verse, and I'm trying to, maybe you'll unmute and just read it for us, please, in English.
Do not fear sudden terror or the holocaust of the wicked when it comes. Plan a conspiracy and it will be annulled. Speak your peace and shall not stand, for God is with us. Even till your seniority, I remain unchanged, and even till your ripe old age, I shall endure. I created you and I shall bear you. I shall endure and rescue.
Okay, so that's actually one of the prayers that I never used to say until after my husband passed away, because I used to only be in an Ashkenazi shul. I've never ever been in any other shul before. But after my husband passed away, I moved to the beach, to East Boca, and I used to go to a Chabad shul there with Rabbi and Rebbetzin New. And they used to add this verse, and they actually used to sing it to the tune, which is a very similar tune that I think Terry Farkas sings when she leads the davening for the Rosh Chodesh tune. But if you think about it, for us, it has a lot of meaning here at Torah Or, because they talk about us reaching our seniority and our old age and how God still is with us. And isn't that an amazing thing to believe? To be able to believe that when you're old, that God is still with you, and that even when you have ailments, and even when you're sick, and even when things are not going well for you and things aren't going smoothly for you, like what happened in COVID, when COVID really was the disease of old people more than even young people. It's amazing to be able to believe that you could get through this, and that God would still rescue us and still save us and still help us. So I always do, when I say my private Amida, I always do add that at the end, even though the shul itself will not, they don't sing it at the end of the Amida, which they do in most of these other congregations. Like, as I said, the ones that daven Nusach Ari or Nusach Sfardi or things like that, they sing the tune.
Sure.
Again, I would actually hope one day, again, this would happen. My goal actually in my class is to co-teach and to have, because the shul is not happy with me singing songs of, like, they wouldn't allow me to sing the song, even though at the moment I think I've only got women on, but still they wouldn't be happy for me to sing the song, because in case a man might watch the video or something, I don't know exactly the rule, but they said that if any songs or davening has to be done with a tune, then I need a male verse. So my hope is to get one of the chazanim from the shul or somebody who knows the tune to sing these tunes for us, so that we can learn them. And actually that way, when you sing, it's also good for children to learn the songs, because if children learn the songs, they learn davening so much easier than if that thing, and they learn these words. Like when I was in this Chabad shul that I was in, the children, they could sing the song at the end of the service. Nearly every single one of them could sing this Al Tira and Aleinu L'Shabeach. They could sing that. They could sing the whole tune together. And there's many shuls where you actually see, like when my husband and I were living in Montoya Circle, my husband was in charge of the children to come up to the bima and do the whole Aleinu and the Anim Zmirot and all the stuff together. And all the young children under bar mitzvah would come and stand around the bima and do that. And they would sing these songs and they would tune. Before that, they might be running around or going to groups or doing something else, but they would all come into the main shul and sing and do these songs. And now, unfortunately, what's happened is that they've been farmed out of there and sent to go to groups and sent to do this and sent to do the next things. And people have forgotten to bring them back into the main shul. But I'm going to just give a little picture of what happened to me this weekend. I was at my son's shul on Friday night, and my grandson was actually the only little boy that was in shul in that particular minyan that they went to. And so he was invited to go up and to sing Yigzal at the end of the service. And I was sitting there watching him, and it was so nice to hear him sing so loudly and so beautifully, and to know the whole of Yigdal off by heart, and to sing it, and then for the community to respond, just to do everything. It was just such a beautiful thing to watch. And I know that on Saturday mornings, eventually he's going to do Anim Zmirot with all the boys, and all of that's going to come back now that COVID is over, because COVID basically put a stop to all of that and all these things happening. And so, you know, that for me is a very nice thing.
Sure.
And then basically we come to the end of Mincha, which is basically going to be the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish. Okay, and that's the one that you say if you've got a yortzeit, or if you've got, or if you're saying, unfortunately, if you're in mourning. Okay, remember the 7 mourners, as I mentioned last week, would be, unfortunately, for a child, which hopefully none of us have to have that as one of our things in our life. And otherwise for your brothers or your sister. And then, of course, you would also have for your parents, would be the other 2 mourners, and then again for your spouse. And so those would be, so the son, daughter, brother, sister, mother, father, and your spouse would make up the seven mourners. So for example, for me, my mother's yortzeit is coming up now. It's going to be on the 26th of Tammuz, which is going to be I think it's the 5th and the 6th, the night of the 5th and the 6th of July. So if I go to shul, then I make sure that I say Kaddish. In fact, I try to go to shul and say Kaddish. And this year I'm hoping to be with my dad so that I can actually take my dad to shul so that he can say Kaddish too for my mother. So these are things that we do at the time of that. And again, yes, in the old days, women didn't say these things and women didn't used to do it. But you know what? If somebody's saying it in shul anyway, and there's no reason why a woman can't be saying it along. And if you're on the woman's side of the shul, there's no reason why you shouldn't be saying amen to the woman. And another thing that's important when you say mourner's Kaddish, I think that a woman should try to keep up with everybody else that's saying it, which means that, you know, when Rabbi Yasker used to make sure that everybody would go to the bima and say Kaddish at the bima, that was a very good thing, because then everybody would be saying it together at the same time, and everybody would be saying amen at the same time. And remember, I told you how important it is again with prayers. The more the prayers go up to heaven at the same time, the better it is. Hashem hears prayers when they come in unison from more people than if they don't. Yes, Cherna.
Raising my hand. Where we used to go to shul, actually it was a Young Israel, and they didn't say the Kaddish together. And when Eugene had to say Kaddish, my husband, he didn't have a good Hebrew background. It was very hard for him. He could never keep up with them, never. And he used to always say, why can't we say it together? No, it's not done that way. Well, I'm so thankful that now it's different. And I think in the shuls that we go to, they all say it together. And it
Correct.
just, you know, especially, and there are a lot of people who say Kaddish who are only in shul to say Kaddish, unfortunately, I guess, but
Correct.
they don't really know. And it's a wonderful thing. I'm so glad that's how
I don't know if you remember Robert Goodman that used to come to my class.
Yeah,
He's just headed up north now. So he said he doesn't know when he'll be able to come. But he was also concerned about that. That was one of his big concerns, was that he couldn't keep up with the Kaddish because some people would just rush through it and then he couldn't say it. And you know what, again, as I said, when I taught the class, it's such an important prayer because it's the same as a Kedusha. Saying Kaddish is the same as saying Kedusha. And if people think Kedusha is so important, then why shouldn't they think Kaddish is important? And people shouldn't be talking. This is the end of the service, okay? It has to be said in the presence of a minyan, it says, okay? It has to be said. It shouldn't be the end of the service now because Mincha's over and it's the end of the service. And we should all talk now while the other people are saying Kaddish. That shouldn't be happening. We should be respectful. We should listen and we should all say Kaddish and we should all say amen to it, because remember, there's nothing that talks about death in this prayer. It's only about Kaddish, the sanctification of God's name. That's all that it is. There's nothing about death. The only reason the people that are mourners are asked to say it is because they have to, at that time of trouble and their time of woe, when things are so bad for them, that's when they have to realize that God is still holy. That's how the Kaddish connects to Al Tirah. Don't fear. Remember, we just said that, don't fear sudden terror. Don't fear the Holocaust of the wicked. Don't fear these things. Okay, you know how many people have blown the Holocaust out of proportion? I'm not saying the Holocaust wasn't bad for the Jews. It was bad for 6 million other people too. But it's blown out of proportion compared to other things. What about the pogroms in Europe? What about those people? What about those Americans that had to run away in the 1880 and come to America, when the majority of Jews came to America? They had to run away because the pilgrims were killing these people in little towns. The Russians were, whatever the Russian was, I don't know, whatever the Russian government was, that was killing them because they were Jewish.
Tsar.
Okay, so there wasn't mass burning like there was in the 20th century, but it wasn't much better in the 19th century. It wasn't much better when the Torquemada went to take over people in Spain and Portugal and was killing them then, or the Crusades. Nothing was much better. Just the number of people were less because the number of people that were alive were less. And if we don't think that COVID and dying in COVID had something to do with something that God planned, then we've really got problems, because otherwise, I don't know, we've lost track. We've lost track of what's important in life if we don't focus on Hashem and the sanctification of Hashem. And yes, a lot of people during COVID had to say Kaddish. A lot more people than had to, because they lost family and members during Kaddish. I mean, during COVID, just like a lot of people have to say because of the Holocaust, as you said, Cherna, and a lot of people have to say because they've lost their parents young, or because of diseases that were incurable, or just because they got killed in some motor car accident, or something terrible happened to them when they were young. So you know what? People are really focused on this because there's not a reason why. There is a reason why the rabbis chose this. They chose this because they want us to know that no matter what happens, we still have to know that Hashem is there for us and Hashem will be there for us. So that basically lands up being the conclusion of Mincha.
Okay,
So
one question, please. You said the Kaddish said for 7 family members.
Correct.
Mother,
so
father, sisters, and brothers.
So let me go over them for you so it's easy to remember, okay? It's a sister and a brother.
Yes.
A mother and a father.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's a son and a daughter. Which unfortunately, as you get older, is a possibility. My grandmother buried 2 daughters. Right. And my other grandmother buried my father's twin brother. You know, my father that sometimes joins my class. So unfortunately, when you get older, like they both lived to 94 and 99, that's not unusual. And I think we've been seeing that even on some of the emails we've been getting.
Right.
You know, that people have been burying their sons. And not necessarily from COVID. I mean, from just a heart attack or a whatever, you know, something that happens. So that's unfortunate. And then the 7th one is always your spouse.
It's what? I'm sorry?
Your spouse.
It's spouse. Got it.
Your spouse. So if you're a husband, it would be your wife. And if you're a wife, it would be your husband, your late husband. Those are the 7 mourners. And those are all the halakhat to do with mourning are based around that. Okay. So all the laws of mourning are based around that. Okay. Those are the 7 mourners. And that's one of the reasons why those are the people who sit Shiva. Those are the people who have to say Kaddish. Okay, also, Alice, just out of interest, when do you say the Kaddish? Okay, so for the children, you say for 11 months, you say Kaddish, even though you mourn for 12 months. You don't say Kaddish for the last month because you the point of Kaddish is to raise the level of the neshama. Remember, we discussed this before in the class. Right. The purpose of Kaddish is to raise the level of the neshama. So for a child, because of the fact that one of the 10 commandments is to honor your mother and your father, the child has to say it for longer than for the rest of the relatives. The rest of the relatives only say it for 30 days, which is very weird because if you think about it, if you lose a child, then you only have to do it for 30 days. Whereas if you lose a parent, you have to do it for 11 months. It doesn't seem, in the way of how you'd feel emotionally, but it's because the parent. And actually another thing about the Kaddish that I read recently when my uncle died, I read it in Norman Lamb's book on mourning. You're not allowed to actually pass off the Kaddish onto somebody else. You actually can't pay it became accustomed to do that. I know that people did that, but actually it's better to try. You don't have to say it every day. You don't have to say it all the time. It's better to try and say it as often as you can during the period of time than to pass it off onto somebody else and not do it, especially the children. The children definitely are not allowed to pass it off onto somebody else. The children actually themselves should try to say it, but it's like for me, I'll tell you what we did. When my mother died, my brothers obviously tried to say it as much as often because they tried to daven with the minyan as much as possible. But I definitely, and my sister said it whenever we were in shul. So if we were in shul on a Friday night or a Saturday or whatever, we'd do the same. And then when my late husband passed away, my daughter also wanted to commit to doing it. She really was dedicated to going to shul and everything. And she wanted to commit to doing it for the 12 months. And I said to her, you're not going to be able to do that because, with a woman and she was married and she, you've got a husband. It's not going to work. It's not, you just, I mean, we're not, that's another reason women are not obligated. I said to her, why don't you just commit that you're going to do it whenever you're in shul? And so that's what she did. But when she has the yortzeit, then she always goes and she does it. She makes sure on the day of the yortzeit, she'll go to all 3 services and try to say it.
Right.
But again, now she's got small children, so sometimes she can't. And similarly, that's what we do now. I do it when it's my husband's yortzeit or my mother's yortzeit, or, then I try to, those are for me, luckily for me, I guess those are the only people that close to me that have died of my 7 relatives. So then I try to get to shul and say it. But sometimes if I can't, I can't, and then, luckily for us during COVID, you could have sort of done it in Zoom by listening in Zoom or something. I don't know. But, a lot of the non-Orthodox shuls, they actually did Kaddish during Zoom time. That's how they did it. That's how let's call them the conservadox. I'm very I don't know, I hate labels like these things. I don't like, I can sort of talk about Judaism left, middle, and right if you want, but I don't like that fine line between, what's Orthodox and what's conservadox and what's, I don't really like those labels. So anyway, but the point is, as Shona said earlier, people do try to say Kaddish, and that was one of the big things that actually stayed during COVID in all of the other synagogues. They did stay, and they did stay on Zoom. Even Beth Shalom Ba'as, they stayed on Zoom nearly all the time. They still had their services on Zoom. Whereas there's a lady in my building who goes to that shul. She's a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor. She lives in Yarmouth here by me. And she didn't go, and she was very upset because she was so upset that she couldn't do Zoom because she's Shomer Shabbat. And so she couldn't put the computer on. And her family didn't feel safe for her to go to Torah Or, so she didn't go to Torah Or. So you know what I'm saying? Everything is debatable, and that's one of the reasons why in the Pirkei Avot it actually says, "Asei lecha rav v'kanei lecha chaver," which means make for yourself a teacher, not necessarily a rabbi. It doesn't translate. Rav doesn't translate from Hebrew to a rabbi. It means make yourself a teacher, and then you're going to get a friend. In other words, it means you're going to have someone who's going to advise you on what the things are to do and what the halachot are to do, which again means for some people, it means they make themselves a rabbi and they follow that rabbi. Okay. For me, it's been hard to do that. I lived in South Africa in a lot of different communities. Okay. So it's been hard to follow the same rabbi, but when I do ask a question of a rabbi, then I do follow that halakha. But if I don't follow it, then maybe I just study it from a book, or maybe I just do the customs of my family or the customs of my synagogue, or whatever it is. Let's give you an example. When my mother died, I was actually already living in America. And the customs that were at the shul at BRS were different than what they did in South Africa. And I had to ask the rabbi the customs to find out what the customs were. And the rabbi actually wasn't there. My mother died, as I told you, in July. Okay. So July, the rabbi had taken a 6-week sabbatical from the BRS, Boca Raton Synagogue. So there was an assistant rabbi that was filling in for him, just like Rabbi Green was filling in the last 2 weeks for Rabbi Yaska, right? Okay. So my husband said, call the rabbi in Israel. And the rabbi said, well, he doesn't really have time now because he's studying in yeshiva and he needs to study in yeshiva and whatever. But whatever the other rabbi says will be fine with him. So then my husband and I set up an appointment to meet with this other rabbi whose name was Rabbi Klein. Rabbi Klein was also a Holocaust survivor. Now, Rabbi Klein would have been considered a conservadox rabbi because his shul had separate men and women seating, but also mixed men and women seating. They didn't give women aliyot.
Never heard of that.
Okay, they didn't give women things, but they only had a rabbi and they only had men doing everything, but they did allow for some mixed seating. Okay, but he came to BRS synagogue and he sat there and he became the second rabbi every time our rabbi went away. Every time that Rabbi Brander went away or went to Israel or had a simcha, this rabbi became the rabbi that filled in. Until eventually they did get a second rabbi, but they didn't have a second rabbi when we first came. And so when I went to the house, his wife invited me in and she said to me, she said, can I give you some tea? Can I give you some this? Can I give you cake? And me and my husband went into the rabbi's office. And you know what the first thing the rabbi said to me? Have you asked any other rabbi what to do? Because once my husband and I explained to him that we were here to find out what the customs were of America, because we had moved to America in we moved in 95 and this was 96. And we didn't want to do anything to dishonor my mother. We didn't want people to say, oh, look at her mother died and she didn't do this and she doesn't do that and she doesn't do the next thing. And that's the first question the rabbi said, have you asked anybody else? Because if you've asked anybody else, then you need to follow what that rabbi says. And then he explained to me what to do. And actually, he gave me a much stricter and a much harsher thing than Rabbi Brander would have given me. Rabbi Branda at that stage was the head of BRS synagogue. He wouldn't even let me listen to music in my car. Okay, which is not true. A lot of rabbis will allow you to listen to music. It's just live music that you can't listen to. So again, these are things that you ask the rabbi. When my aunt lost her husband last year, she spoke to the rabbi about everything. Like, she didn't want to move the body and whatever. And she spoke to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, well, actually, Rabbi Yaska was the one who told us what to do, because I walked over to Rabbi Yaska's house and then walked over to my aunt. And she knew, but they knew because my uncle was terminal, and they knew that my uncle wouldn't want his body moved on a Shabbat. So they followed the procedure. They didn't call whatever they called Levitt Weinstein to come and take the body out of the house, because that's what he didn't want. He didn't want to be moved on Shabbat, because in South Africa, that's what we did. Again, all these things are customs and traditions that came, they did come from rabbis. They came eventually from somebody that was the teacher. And that's why it's very important to have a teacher, to have someone you follow and to ask questions. But my class, as I said, for now, is going to focus on what is done at the moment in Torah or in the way it is, because that's where we all belong. That's the place I'm giving the class for. And this is how I want to do it. And eventually I'm going to go live, but my goal is still to have it filmed so that I still will be able to have people who can't come live see it. And I'm going to teach like that, just like Marty Levine did it. And like other people have done it, because now I'm vaccinated and now I can. And when now I'm here in Boca and I can teach live if they want me to. And if they don't want me to, then I'll just carry on doing it on Zoom, however they want it to be at the moment, while they're still building this new shul. And, I'm going through the different parts of the service.
Can I say a word?
Yes.
I just wanted to say, when my father died, which was 1978, I had the 4 brothers at that time. They were all alive. The thought of my saying Kaddish, never. It entered my mind. It wouldn't have entered anybody else's mind. I mean, it just wasn't about to happen. My mother died in 2002. And by then I was teaching. I taught at a conservative school for almost 40 years. And I said Kaddish every day in Minyan. And it was a very, I don't want to say liberating, because that sounds like women's lib, and that's not what it's about.
But uplifting.
It just uplifting. It was a very uplifting feeling to know that I could do that.
Exactly.
And then at the end of the 11 months, I actually had the honor of giving a siyum, which I also would have never, and the kids there in that school probably never heard of having a siyum either. So it was a great experience.
So it was an educational experience for other people too, about doing what you do. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's just, and I think that's one of the things. I mean, to me, that's one of the things why I was passionate about my teaching this class, because I started doing it when I was in high school. I started teaching Tefillah in high school, where for the new students who came to school, we were in a community day school. So we had a very, very broad spectrum of Jewish people, some that weren't like were Reform, actually. Maybe only the father was Jewish and not the mother, or the mother was Jewish and not the father. Okay. And then we had obviously Orthodox, practicing Orthodox. And then we had people who went to Orthodox shuls and Reform shuls. We didn't have conservative in South Africa. So it was all like a spectrum. So what happened is, when I was in 11th grade, the head of the Jewish studies teacher decided that maybe that some of us children needed to teach the young ones that were coming into the middle school or to the high school that had never davened tefillah before, because to put them into communal tefillah, they were just lost. You were singing the songs and doing the tunes, and they couldn't follow. They couldn't read Hebrew. They couldn't do anything. So there were a group of us that used to take these kids and teach them how to do tefillah. And that's how they eventually, and then once a week on a Friday, we would all do it together, whatever happened. And then, but it wasn't a discipline thing. Like one of the things that I noticed that a lot of Jewish day schools that I was at, it would become a discipline thing. And then the kids would be turned off from tefillah, because there would be someone there enforcing them to daven and making them daven and making them pray. And that's not that's not a good feeling to have about tefillah. I mean, and then we wonder why so many of our teenagers and eventually college students go what we call off the derech. They leave to Judaism because they're not connected to Hashem themselves. They've been forced to do it, either by their parents or by their teachers. There's just no direct connection to God. They don't feel that actual connection. And therefore, if someone teaches them in a loving way and not in a threatening way and not in a way that's negative, like the way you did, Cherna, then they learn these things, then they'll see them again one day. And then we hope and pray. We always hope and pray the Mashiach's going to come. And when the Mashiach comes, everybody's going to turn back and recognize God. So whatever somebody's doing now, I actually just bought a nice book back from New York from my daughter-in-law. It's got a list of the 613 commandments, what they are. And if you look at them, the majority of them have got to do with fellow man. Like Shabbat is one. You know, Shabbat is not a million things. Shabbat is one of them. You know, keep Shabbat, and that's it. You know, okay, then make it holy. Okay, so that's another one. But do you get what I'm trying to say? Most of the laws, they've got to do with treating your fellow man, being nice to your fellow man. So how can you be a judge? How can you decide that this person's more religious than that person, or this person's more observant than that? That's why when people say to me, oh, you're Shomer Shabbat, or oh, you go to Orthodox, I hate those labels, because how does anybody know? The only judge is true judge is God. I mean, if you look back in the Amida that we just went over, the Shmoneh Esrei, that's what it says in that Shmoneh Esrei. We talk about the judge. Who is the true judge? The true judge is God. On Yom Kippur, when we went over the prayers of Yom Kippur, what do we say? Who's the true judge? The true judge is God. It's not for us to be the judge of other people while we live on this earth. And you don't know what other people do. You think you see things, you see them do this, you see them do that. You don't know what other people do. And that's really, really important. But seeing people say Kaddish, as you say, Chernish, is uplifting for the mourner. And definitely it's also a recognition to Hashem that the children that are following behind are doing good things in memory of their parents, coming to shul, davening, praying, saying services. And that's one of the reasons why people will come to shul, as you said, Shon, again. They'll come and they'll come and daven Mincha Ma'ariv every day, or come and daven Shacharit in the morning with a minyan, or try to at least do it. Okay, and that's, as I say, why I kept services alive during COVID and on Zoom, because people wanted to do that. It kept people having services outside, like in Yerushalayim, where they had the first case of COVID. They were having services outside all the time with socially distances. You know, they weren't doing stupid things like trying to continue having them in shul like some people did, and then there was COVID was rampant. You know what I'm saying? God doesn't believe that you mustn't help yourself. You know, God helps those that help themselves. It's kind of a Christian idea, but it's not just a Christian idea. It's a Jewish idea too. You know, you have to save your own soul as well. You can't just, you have to believe in medicine. You have to believe in all these things that can help you. But basically, in the end, the belief in tefillah is something that helps you connect yourself. Sorry, that's just my phone as usual going. I don't know why, but anyway. Must be the end time near the end of the show. But anyway, so that's basically the idea. And so the mincha that we've discussed before is the same as the mincha that we've discussed previous times. The only difference is it gives somebody, again, an opportunity to come to shul and say Kaddish. We don't say the tachanun. We leave that out. And then there's an interesting thing that we add at the end, okay? And this is actually funny because I didn't realize that this was actually part of mincha. I used to think that this was part of Kabbalat Shabbat, but it's on page 500, and let me just get the exact page for you. This is it's 590. Everybody can turn to page 590.
90.
590. Okay, now the only reason I realized this again was when I looked at the Nusach Sfard book. Okay, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that this says, well, first of all, if you look at the top of the page where it says page on 591, it says Su'udash Teshit. Do you see that? Everybody knows Su'udash Teshit hopefully is the third meal of the day. So why do we sing this prayer in between Mincha? Well, I used to think it was Mincha and Kabbalat Shabbat, but it's actually part of Mincha. Why do we sing it at Su'udash Teshit and we sing it in Kabbalat Shabbat? And that's going to be my discussion starting point next week. Okay? Because basically, we say this prayer as part of Mincha. And remember I told you about at the beginning, I told you about this book called the Nusach Sfard book. If you actually look at the Erev Shabbat, the Erev thing book, they've actually got Yedid Nefesh before they do Ashrei. They actually do it in Mincha at the beginning of Mincha. That's the Nusach Sfard. Okay, and Ashkenazim, we do it at the end of Mincha, after the Kaddish, but before we start Kabbalat Shabbat.
I have a friend who's from Israel, originally from Tunisia, and she says when they make Kiddush, they sing it.
Correct. Okay, so there's actually 2 times in the day we say it, and actually, if you look at the tunes, the tunes are different. Like the tunes are what we call more lebedik when we say it on Friday night, and more somber when we say it on Saturday afternoon. Okay, we don't say it with the same happiness. And the reason is because on Friday night, we're very happy to say this tune. Okay, and on Saturday afternoon, when Shabbat is ending, we're very sad to say this tune. And when we discuss Shudash Yishit, you'll see that we will say it. But in Ashkenazi shuls, we say it twice. We say it at the end of Mincha, before we start the Kabbalat Shabbat. And we say it again during the Shudash Yishit, before, that's between Mincha and Ma'ariv, okay? After we said Shabbat Mincha, between Mincha and Ma'ariv, before we say the end of Shabbat, okay? So we actually say it again. And as I said, the tunes are so important because the one is a very levitic, happy tune, because we're so happy Shabbat is coming. And the second one is a very sad and somber tune because we're very unhappy that Shabbat is leaving. And I guess with that, I'm going to leave you unless there are any more questions. Anybody need anything else to ask? And I have got the notes more or less ready.
This is not a question, but I guess I'm just full of talk today. I have to catch up on the whole year that I wasn't able to come to the class. In my Siddur, which my kids brought me from Israel when my youngest daughter spent her year in Israel, it doesn't say Sudat Shlishit, by the way. I'm surprised to see it says Shalosh. Well, if I say it in English, Shalosh.
Okay, so let me explain that again. This I kind of didn't talk about. Maybe I did talk about it during my shiur. Okay, now in Ashkenaz, the pronunciation of the T's, the tets, right, is without the dot. They say sa. They say sa. Yeah. Yeah. But so again, one of the things that happens on top, whereas in Sfarad, if you do Nus of Sfarad, they don't do that. They say ta. Okay, and remember, I think I've discussed this before. The one is the correct, the Hebrew way as the Israelis say it, and the other one is the way that came from Europe. Mm-hmm. Okay, the one was the pronunciation that came from Europe, and the one was the pronunciation that's done in Israel based on the Hebrew language. Okay, so again, if you get a transliterated siddur, which I mean I have a few here, you will get a different transliteration in the thing. But I always do my transliterations according to the Hebrew. Okay, the Israeli way. I do it the Israeli way. So I don't say the sa. I always say the ta.
No, I was talking about
Sudashli shit.
Right, but this doesn't say Sudat Shlishit. It has the words the other way. Shalosh.
Oh, Shalosh. Okay, I think it might say that also in the art scroll.
Shalosh Sudat. Sudot.
Yeah, because it's not the only prayer you say for the Sadash Shudat. It's for you say a whole lot of things. That must have something to do with the Hebrew again, the way that I do. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in the service when we're discussing Shabbat.
Kind of weird.
It's the third part of the meal. It's part of the right, service that you have to have. Remember, you have to have 3 meals on Shabbat. So it's Friday night, Saturday lunch, and then the third meal is between Mincha and Ma'ariv. You all know that? You all remember that? We have to have Friday night. That's why we don't eat really before shul on Saturday morning, other than if you have to take medication or if you've got a headache, I guess, or something like that, you would have some sort of a snack. And remember, a lot of people also sometimes make a kiddush in between. Sometimes there's kiddush clubs. There's all these different things, but we don't actually eat until we have lunch on Saturday because we have three meals. That's the goal, is to have the 3 meals. And again, that's all part of the Shabbat experience that we're going to talk about during this class. So I hope you enjoyed the class today. I'm going to stop the recording so that people who couldn't make it can catch up. And I'll try to get the notes posted. But as I said, I've got my grandchildren with me. So it's just a case of always for me updating them so that they look good and they're worthwhile for somebody to look at and read and print out. Okay. And then, of course, I've got Cherna, my proofreader, and Alice also to check on me. Anyway, Barbara, if you want to unmute yourself, you can also do that.